Hi, my name is Angela Huang, and this summer I worked under the Center for Policy Impacting Global Health under Dr. Wenhui Mao, tracking global vaccine R&D financing mechanisms. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the public has grown more and more aware of the very complex background that goes into vaccine development. The COVID vaccine also was pushed forward through the financing landscape very quickly. And it is really admirable to see how we have made many innovations within vaccine financing recently. However, there still remain significant gaps in how we develop vaccines, and this is especially prevalent for neglected diseases that affect low-income countries and low-middle-income countries. Um, this is really important because vaccines can be seen as sort of a public good, something that can be accessed by a lot of people and are very, very important to preventing and controlling a lot of diseases, especially infectious diseases. So moving forward, we wanted to better understand this vaccine R&D landscape, to better understand these gaps and how to push forward the research and improve the way that vaccines are financed today. So there are two objectives in our research project. First, we wanted to identify strategies for vaccine development in the current financing landscape. And two, we wanted to map what kinds of financing mechanisms potential candidates can seek support from. To do this, we essentially took in financing mechanisms from the UNICEF database and the GFinder database. We eventually distilled out 24 mechanisms using our selection process that you can see in this middle panel. One thing that I really want to highlight here is that we wanted to put a focus on global vaccine R&D financing. And so we removed any single country mechanisms. What this means is basically a US agency couldn't only finance US labs or US research, they also had to finance research that happens outside of the country. So we then extracted information from these mechanisms' websites or any external publications to better understand their priorities and see how this relates to their other portfolio of projects. We found eventually that vaccine R&D often receives financial support from bilateral agencies, multilateral agencies, and private charitable organizations. So there's a great diversity of funders. The top funding mechanisms were commonly based in North America, especially in the United States and European regions, such as the UK and France. Among these financing mechanisms, a lot of the funding was located to HIV/AIDS research, malaria research, tuberculosis research, and diarrheal diseases. However, we can still see that there are a vast diversity of disease that still don't get that much funding within this process. Notably, funders most commonly funded basic research in early phases of clinical trial. Phase 1 was especially commonly funded. However, some funders supported clinical trials past phase 3. Interestingly enough, as we were exploring these snapshots, we found that some funders did not actually specify which vaccine R&D stages they support, and this is a point that we'll get to in a second. So a couple of takeaways that we took from here. First, we found that vaccine R&D funders needed a greater inclusion of low-income country and low-middle-income country decision makers. There were very few snapshots, very few mechanisms that we found that truly included these decision makers within the process. Yet this is actually very important when there is funding allocated to neglected diseases, because we want to make sure that there are people receiving and purchasing these vaccines after it goes through the clinical trial process. One thing to note is that there were a few key examples of some really good low middle income country inclusion. This includes the Hillman Lab, which is a combination of Merck and Wellcome Trust. And this was really important and really good to see that we can take some inspiration from these labs and incorporating more diverse voices within this process. We also found that information related to vaccine R&D financing tends to be fragmented and ambiguous, especially for bilateral agencies. Bilateral agencies tended to have multiple units responsible for vaccines, whether it be for governance, clinical development, awareness. And sometimes we wouldn't even be able to really pinpoint exactly what projects they were funding and any details about those projects. And this makes it really difficult to track any research that is being done. And I think more transparency in general in this respect would be really helpful. Finally, we would really like to see more details on which vaccine R&D stages that these organizations support, because we realize that a lot of late-stage clinical trials oftentimes need more funding, and it'd be really great to have more transparency on exactly where they're allocating their research so that researchers in the future can begin more accurately identifying gaps and perhaps even identifying some incentives to address these gaps. So I would love to hear any thoughts or questions that you have about this research. You can always contact me at angela.huang@duke.edu. Thank you so much.